Welcome to session 4 of the 6 days of Genesis. In this session, we're going to be looking at day 5 of creation, God making the sea and air creatures. Before we do that, I think we ought to just recap a little bit over where we've gone so far in our first 3 sessions. In our first session, we emphasized that God made the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. We said that it had to be literal 24-hour days. We used various scripture proofs to show that the grammar has to be 6 literal days when you compare Genesis 1 with Numbers chapter 7. And we also saw in that session that the creation had to be approximately 6,000 years ago. We don't know exactly, we're not going to say exactly to the minute how old the creation is, but it must be about 6,000 years old, give or take a couple of hundred. We know that it couldn't be 7,000 years, for example. That would not fit with the scripture dates that we have. In our second session, we looked at the first 3 days of creation. We saw that on the first day, God created the heavens and the earth and everything that's in them. On the second day, God created the expanse, dividing the waters above from the waters below. And on the third day, God made the dry land and he made the plants. In our third session, we looked at day 4 of creation. So we looked at how God made the sun, moon and stars. And we looked at the problems that there are with the Big Bang Theory. And we looked at the various creation models that there are to help explain the mechanism that God used in order for light from the stars to get to the earth. So now we're going to look at sea creatures and we're going to be looking at flying creatures. We know that God made creatures of air and water. We read in Genesis about that. We're putting this into the context, don't forget, of this verse that we've quoted a few times from Romans chapter 1 verse 20. Since the creation of the world, his, that is God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. People want to make excuses for not believing in God. People claim that they don't believe in God, but in actual fact we've seen that people actually do in their hearts believe in God. They simply suppress that truth in unrighteousness. Since the creation of the world, everything about the world just screams out that there is a God, including what we're going to look at today. We're looking at the creation of flying creatures, and we're looking at the creation of sea creatures. So we're talking about, in the case of flying creatures, we're talking about birds, we're talking about bats, other flying creatures. In the case of sea creatures, we're talking about fish, and it talks about the great sea monsters in some versions, or whales, as it puts it in other versions. We're talking about aquatic mammals and aquatic variations of other types of creatures, all being created then on the 5th day of creation, the 5th day of creation. Now, of course, this causes many people a problem because they believe, for example, that whales evolved from land animals. I saw a marvellous cartoon once, which you'll have to picture because I can't get hold of it for copyright reasons, so we can't display it. So I'm just going to explain the cartoon to you. And the cartoon had a fish dragging itself up out of the sea onto the dry land, evolving basically into a land animal. In the other direction, this large whale came down with 4 legs, padding down the coast towards the sea, and it said, "It's all yours, mate, you're welcome to it." Christians who want to believe in the theory of evolution have a problem. Let's have a look at how they try and resolve this problem. One website, which is a theistic evolution website, says this. It says, God created evolution, and he guides it and controls it for his own purposes. Evolution is not an accident, and it does not happen according to any mechanistic process. The Bible speaks of the 6 days of creation. This does not mean everything was created in 6 literal 24-hour days. So God accomplished his great work of creation in 6 distinct stages, or days, ending with the creation of man. Now his major work is done, and he continues to fine-tune it in an evolutionary manner, guiding and controlling this himself. So whenever an atheist tries to tell you that you were created not by God, but by evolution, you can reply, yes, but God created evolution. He guides it and controls it. What a marvellous thing to say to people. Try saying that and see if they fall on their knees and ask you how they might be saved. There are many Christians who want to attempt to harmonise Genesis chapter 1 with the theory of evolution. I've even heard some say that maybe these days of creation are sort of stages, eras in the process of evolution. But it doesn't actually work. You see, there are some fundamental differences between the way things would have worked had evolution been true and the way that the Bible accounts things in its record of creation in Genesis chapter 1. For example, evolution would suggest that marine creatures developed before land plants. Somehow there'd be creatures in the sea, and eventually land plants would have been able to get out and colonize the land. The Bible puts this the other way around. It says that land plants were created on day 3, whereas marine creatures were created on day 5. So there's a complete difference there. They're the opposite way round. They don't fit. There are some other well-known examples like that. Another good example would be the supposed evolution of whales, that land animals are supposed to have evolved into whales. You know the idea, sea creatures evolved into land animals who then got fed up of living on the land and went back to the sea. If land animals evolved before whales, that's contrary to the way that the Bible puts it, because the Bible says that whales were created on day 5 and land animals on day 6. Yet another one. Birds are supposed to have evolved from dinosaurs. So you've got dinosaurs first and then birds have evolved from those. But the Bible has that the other way round. Birds were created on day 5 and dinosaurs, being land animals, must have been created on day 6. So you see, when you actually analyse it, it isn't possible to state that the 6 days of creation are long eras. We've seen before that the 6 days cannot be long periods of time. They have to be 6 24-hour periods. But even if you could stretch them to be long periods of time, they're in a different order than the order of the theory of evolution. You can't say that the days of creation are 6 eras of evolution. What's always interesting to me is that when people take the theory of evolution and try and harmonise it with the Bible, that because they don't fit, one of them is going to have to be messed with. Guess which one it always is? People always seem to want to change the Bible rather than change their own man-made ideas. Well, what we go on to find out then is that according to the Bible, God created birds. God created birds. But when you read Genesis, if you look in the King James Version, it says that God created fowl. And there's a reason for a different word there. Today, the word fowl is actually more restrictive than the word birds. What I understand by fowl, I would guess, would be creatures like chickens and turkeys and things that I can put on my dinner plate. That's what I sort of assume with fowl. But in 1611, the word fowl would actually have been wider than the word for birds. And that's fair enough, because the Hebrew word used here is uf, and that is not the same as the word that is usually translated as birds elsewhere in the Bible. The Hebrew word oph actually describes flying creatures. For example, if you turn to Leviticus chapter 11, you will find there that locusts are described as oph. In the King James Version, it says that locusts are fowl. It's interesting that the King James Version doesn't translate the Hebrew word oph as birds. It translates it as fowl. To us, it seems as if the word fowl is more restrictive than birds, but of course in the early 17th century the word fowl was much wider and seems therefore to include not only birds but other flying creatures too, like bats, like insects, and I would argue like pterodactyls too. So it seems that the King James Version translation there makes more sense, broadening things out. What's actually being talked about is God creating flying creatures in general. Of course, when we sort of pick fossils out of the ground of pterodactyls, there is no way that just by looking at the fossil that I can actually prove that those dinosaurs flew. And there is actually some debate on that. There are some people who think that those dinosaurs did not fly. However, I'm not necessarily going to disagree with evolutionists on everything, particularly on things that don't pertain to evolution. And if you look at a fossil of a pterodactyl, I don't think there is any reason to suppose it didn't fly. Its wing structure looks rather like a bat. I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption to say that it flew. But please don't ever run away with the idea that we've proved that they flew. Now, there are other reasons that evolutionists wouldn't accept, actually, why I think that pterodactyls flew. I'll probably come to that a bit later, because I think that some people have seen them, and therefore I think we have some story accounts of these things flying. But that's beside the point. From the fossils, just by showing you the fossils, I cannot prove that pterodactyls flew. Nevertheless, I'm happy to accept they did. And I think that most of us as creationists do accept that pterodactyls were flying creatures. Now, evolutionists obviously want to believe that birds evolved. We've said that they believe that birds evolved from reptiles. So if that's the case, it means that feathers must have evolved. And evolutionists assume that feathers evolved from the scales of reptiles. So you have a look at a picture of a scale, and you have a look at a picture of a feather. And evolutionists assume that scales have changed into feathers. Now, if you just look at these particular pictures, you'll see that they do not look alike. There is actually one way in which they are alike, which is that they are made of a material called keratin, which is a material that's found in many animals. It's actually the same material that you will find that your fingernails and toenails are made out of, and your hair is made out of, and the horn of a rhinoceros is made out of, and the scales of a reptile is made out of, and the feathers of a bird are made out of. But you know, just because they're made out of the same material doesn't mean that they have the same structure or that they do the same job. It's quite clear that your fingernails don't do the same job as your hair, for example. And the idea that the scales could possibly turn into the feathers is nonsensical. Let's have a closer look at feathers. When you look at a magnified picture of feathers, you will see that it's actually made up of a number of barbules and hooks, and they fit together exactly. If you look at the structure of a feather, you can see how it's branched out, but look at it under a scanning electron microscope, and you'll see these tiny little hooks that fit into tiny little cups on the feathers. That's very important because the feathers have got to be airtight, and in the case of some birds, watertight as well. Now that couldn't evolve simply by a scale fraying outwards, and yet this is what they assume. If you look at the diagram of scales evolving into feathers that you will find on that fount of all knowledge, Wikipedia, you will see, I mean, they have a series of pictures. And you start with the scales and you start with the feathers, and you see the scales being split up and sort of fraying at the edges and eventually turning into feathers. The thing is that out of that whole list of pictures that they have in Wikipedia, only the first one and the last one actually exist. None of the others exist. And what you've got to realize is that the hooks and eyes on the feathers absolutely match perfectly. Some people have said that the feather structure of hooks and eyes is a little bit like Velcro, and it is in a sense because you've got these hooks and you've got the sort of loops for them to go into. But it's cleverer than Velcro because Velcro is pretty random, isn't it? You can sort of stick the stuff together where you like. It's actually a little bit more like a zip fastener, really, that the hooks go together perfectly. Imagine the problems that a reptile would have as its scales evolve into feathers. You see, as we've seen, the feathers contain the sort of hook and eye arrangement, but what happens if the hook has evolved and it's a little bit too long to fit into the eye of the feather? It means that the feathers won't lock together properly, the feathers will fall apart, the bird won't be able to fly. That, of course, is also what will happen if it evolves, if the hook evolves too short, or if the hook has evolved and the eye hasn't developed correctly to hook into. It has to be exactly right first time. But you see, this is not the way that evolution is supposed to proceed. Evolution, we hear, proceeds one step at a time. Richard Dawkins wrote a book called Climbing Mount Improbable, when he said that creationists are looking at this difficult sheer face on the mountain, when he said what actually evolution can do is go up the other side and just go at one step at a time. The thing is that that simply doesn't work. Let's have a look at another example. Birds have to preen their feathers, and the gland to actually produce the oil to preen their feathers is on their back. So the bird has to turn its head around, which reptiles can't do, by 180 degrees, get its beak to get into the gland, and of course the beak is exactly the right length to fit into this gland to get the oil to preen its feathers with. What a remarkable coincidence that that evolved just right so that the bird could survive. Of course, those of us who have a scientific mind don't believe in coincidences like that. It's far more sensible to believe that God created it perfectly designed. So we can see when you actually look at the design of feathers that it isn't possible. It simply does not work. You would have to have an amazing amount of blind faith in order to assume that feathers could have evolved. And yet people claim that birds have evolved from dinosaurs. Have a look at this particular newspaper item, for example. On this particular newspaper, taken from a British newspaper called The Independent, you'll see a picture of a dinosaur called an oviraptor. And what you'll notice when you look at the picture is that the oviraptor has got feathers on it. Now, how do they know that the oviraptor has feathers? Look at a fossil of the oviraptor and you'll notice that there are no feathers. All you can see in the fossil are bones. None of the soft parts of the dinosaur have been preserved. You simply see bones. You might look at some models of dinosaurs created. For example, if you go to the Shenandoah Dinosaur Park in the Shenandoah Valley, you'll find that the model of the oviraptors that they've got there do not have feathers. And yet there are textbooks that you can find, and the pictures of the oviraptors in those do have feathers. Why are the feathers there in the pictures? That's because that's the only place you will find the feathers. The feathers are there in the imagination of the person who drew that dinosaur, because they wanted to make out that the dinosaur had evolved from a bird. What's the overall mechanism anyway by which dinosaurs would evolve into birds? Presumably, evolutionists believe that there must have been some dinosaur standing on the edge of a cliff somewhere, flapping its arms and jumping off, in which case what would have happened to it? It would have gone splat, and that would have been the end of that dinosaur. This is all really rather odd, because you see, if natural selection works, then what it would do, surely, is select against those dinosaurs that were daft enough to jump off the cliff. See, by definition, those dinosaurs that did actually try to fly would be eliminated from the species because they would be dead. If natural selection did actually work, then natural selection would be a conservative force. It would be weeding out the ones that were that bit different. In practice, this is not the way that things work at all. Natural selection is supposed to be something that selects against mutations. And remember that natural selection is not evolution. Evolution is supposed to be the upward movement of species, developing brand new information, getting better and better and better. But you see, the very thing that they are looking for, the evolutionists are looking to achieve here, the idea of flight coming from these particular dinosaurs, would actually cause that particular species to be eliminated. So even if natural selection happened, it would be working against the very process of evolution. And yet they come out with some marvellous works of fiction. How about this from a serious scientific website? This is how they suggest that maybe dinosaurs could have started to fly. Two-legged dinosaurs may have used their forelimbs as wing-like structures to propel themselves rapidly up steep inclines long before they took to the skies, reports a University of Montana researcher in the January 17th issue of the journal Science. The new theory adds a middle step that may link two current and opposing explanations for how reptiles evolved into flying birds. Can you picture the scene? You've got a slope, and this dinosaur's running up the slope, and it's flapping its arms, and one day it accidentally takes off. Marvellous, isn't it? Do you know, I wish I could get a grant to do this sort of thing. Wouldn't that be good? I could think of all sorts of explanations for anything, because I think I've got a pretty good imagination. That's what we've got here, isn't it? This is a work of imagination. And that work of imagination has been taken further by some. In 1995, the National Geographic magazine published a major story on the discovery of Archaeoraptor. This was their front page, front cover illustration. And it actually said that we are now certain, beyond any doubt, that pteropods have evolved into birds. Pteropods means sort of bipedal dinosaurs like raptors and like Tyrannosaurus and Allosaurus and so on. So those are the dinosaurs that are supposedly evolved into birds. Before I say what I'm going to say, Archaeoraptor is not the same thing as Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is definitely a real bird. The thing about Archaeoraptor is that it was discovered later that the fossil Archaeoraptor that had been discovered, or rather bought from a fossil seller in China, it turned out really to be two fossils glued together. Archaeoraptor was in fact a fraud, and within a few months National Geographic had to admit this. Of course, as is usual in these cases, the admission of the mistake appeared somewhere in the middle of the magazine, whereas the original problematic report was the front page news with the major picture. But this is a problem. There are so many mistakes and so many errors. People are wanting to find fossil dinosaurs with evidence of feathers, and the evidence simply is not there. What about the supposed evolution of whales from land animals? Well, this is really a question about language and how language is actually used. You see, it's often interesting to go to London's Natural History Museum. If you're ever in London, it's a good free day out. And you'll go into the large mammal exhibition where they've got absolutely life-size models of many large animals. You can see an elephant and a rhinoceros, and also hanging from the ceiling is an enormous blue whale. And then you go upstairs into a gallery and you find a display about the supposed evolution of a whale. And of course, this enormous great creature that's filling this huge warehouse is supposed to have evolved from a rather small dog-like land animal called a mesonychid. What they then do in the display, and this is where the language comes in, is that they have three skulls, one after the other. The first skull shows mesonychid, long snout with nostrils on the end of its snout. The second fossil skull it's got nostrils further up its snout. And the third one, there's a single blowhole, single nostril if you like, on top of the head of the creature. That last one is a modern dolphin, related, probably in the same kind as a whale. And so you've got this evolution there. But then you start to look at why it is that those fossils have been arranged in that order. Because actually, the second fossil is, in literal terms, according to the evolutionist's own dating, older than the first one. Well, they get round that by showing that the first one was supposedly in this sort of bar of time, and the second one in another bar of time where they overlap, so they can reckon that the first one is representative of animals that are much older, even though that particular one isn't. Actually, there's a bit of a circular argument going on here, because the real reason why they've arranged the fossils in this order is because they have assumed that the first one is what the other two have evolved from. In other words, they have been placed in evolutionary order according to their theory. And the display is being presented as evidence that the whales have evolved from the mesonychids. So they're assuming the evolution of the whale from the mesonychids in order to prove the evolution of the whales from mesonychids. That is a circular argument, and it really has no place in London's premier natural scientific museum. Now, in fact, you do find fossils of different cetaceans, whales, dolphins, other ones of different types, and there may have been some development. And you won't find creationists disagreeing with that, because as I showed you in our talk about plants, we said that God made these things according to kinds. And he made the sea creatures according to kinds. And for that reason, creation scientists have developed a science known as baraminology, which comes from Hebrew and Greek mixed together. The baramin bit is important. Bara means created, min means kind. The ology bit means it's a science, so it's a science of the created kind. And this is the method that creationists will use in order to help you understand how creatures may have adapted, because creatures can have adapted within their baramins, within their created kinds. What I'm saying then is that dolphins and porpoises and whales are probably part of the same kind, probably part of the same kind. They could have developed from each other. It's possible. But at no point will a whale have developed into a seal or vice versa. Do you get the idea? You see, God could have created these creatures with sufficient genetic variety that they could have developed from each other. You'll see that particularly in our next talk when we look at land mammals, but you get the same thing with sea animals as well. So you get development within the kind in order to form new species. Remember that a species is not the same as a biblical kind. You can get new species developing, and that process is known as speciation. Speciation. Now, let's get this quite clear, because this is what used to be known in creationist circles as microevolution. The idea that you do see variety within kinds and you do see change within kinds. And then we were able to say, well, we believe microevolution, but we don't believe macroevolution. I think it's probably better for our purposes now to use the words differently and to say this is not evolution at all. When you see variation within a kind, you are simply selecting from existing genetic information. God's already put the genetic information there. That's the way he created those creatures. They're developing. That is speciation. It is not evolution. Evolution is going from molecules to man. It's gaining genetic information as we go along. That is impossible. Not only do you not see it happen, but it's actually impossible. And we can show that it is impossible. And what the evolutionists do is they use bait and switch. They use an example from speciation, like they might say, well, look, this dolphin must have developed from this type of whale. So therefore, that proves that actually they all developed from mesonychids. That's bait and switch, because they're using one definition of evolution here, and then they're using that to say, well, therefore evolution happened on a bigger scale somewhere else. And that's why I don't particularly like the terms microevolution and macroevolution, because it implies that you've just got a bigger version of evolution, and that we're saying we don't like the big types of evolution, but we're okay with the little types of evolution. That's not the case. Variation within a kind is selection from existing genetic information, and at no point is any new genetic information produced. So that is not evolution. It is completely different from the idea of creating new genetic information so that you go from molecules to mankind. That does not happen at any point. It's impossible. So that's what we've seen then. We've seen that God has made this huge variety of sea creatures and of land creatures. We've seen that there are lots of different types of flying creatures, lots of different types of sea creatures. One last thing that I think I want to say about these is that God blessed these animals. Now that's interesting. Why did he bless these animals? He didn't bless the plants. He blessed these sea creatures and flying creatures because they have a different kind of life than the life of plants. In actual fact, the life that these sea creatures have and the life that the land animals are going to have, that we're going to talk about in our next talk, the Hebrew word is nephesh. Nephesh. These creatures have got nephesh. What's meant by the Hebrew concept of nephesh? We see in Genesis 1 that the animals that have nephesh are the ones that God has blessed. So the important biblical and theological aspect of this is the blessing of God. We read in Leviticus that the life of the flesh, the nephesh of the flesh, is in the blood. So we are talking about animals that have blood. So this is an important classification. Remember that a creationist system of classification would not necessarily have to be the same as an evolutionary system of classification. A creationist system would simply be to do with how we as human beings relate to those animals. So we'd be talking about the animals with blood as opposed to the animals without blood. It's different, but to a certain extent we can use one of the evolutionary classifications, the concept of vertebrates and invertebrates. Vertebrates are those with backbones, invertebrates are those that don't have a spine. If we look at the 5 groups of vertebrates, that is fish, amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, all 5 of those have blood. Now, it seems as if there are perhaps certain invertebrates that also have blood, but what we're mostly talking about as animals with blood are vertebrates. Many of what the evolutionists refer to as lower invertebrates do not have blood. Interesting consequence there is that maybe the death of a non-nephesh animal, therefore, is somewhat analogous to the death of a plant and not really the same thing as the death of a nephesh animal. Perhaps, therefore, if I just use a little bit of conjecture here, baleen whales before the fall could still have been eating plankton, even if some of that plankton contained non-nephesh animals. That would not cause us a theological problem. But the real point that I want to emphasize here is that the concept of the animals having blood is important. That's why these animals were blessed. There's something important about blood, because we know that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So right here, even before the fall, in Genesis chapter 1, we are beginning to see echoes of the gospel of Jesus Christ that's going to be developed later. It's important to develop a theology of blood. We cannot separate our science from our theology at any time. And in our science here, where we're talking about a particular class of living creatures, a theological term has come up, that blood is important in our understanding, because blood will always point to the shedding of blood once and for all upon the cross of Jesus Christ. So you can see that we even have elements of the gospel in the very first chapter of Genesis. Isn't that exciting? It's so exciting that we're going to take that up in more detail in our next session. Thank you for listening.
Do you need the tools to defend your faith? Visit our websites for up-to-date content. Attend one of our live events. And shop online at creationstore.org. We are Creation Today.